So, hello everyone. Welcome to the Lighthouse Learning Series. This is the third session of our five-part series. We're super stoked to have our facilitator, Celestina Pearl, here with us today to facilitate Sex Work 101. And for folks who don't know, the Lighthouse Learning Series is our queer harm reduction training series that we open to the community, to you all. But it's just one piece of what we do here at Lighthouse. We're a collective of advocates, community members, harm reduction folks, trans and queer folks who use drugs to engage in sex work. And we discuss the ways to leverage our intersecting movements to disrupt oppressive and carceral systems of care to preserve the autonomy and health and well-being of queer and trans people who use drugs and do sex work. So in addition to this, we're currently working on a gender-affirming care toolkit for all 14 syringe service programs in New York City. We published a report a few months back on how queer and trans people who use drugs and sex workers take care of themselves. And if you want to see more, I'll put the link in for our specific page on the National Harm Reduction Coalition website. And if you're interested in joining Lighthouse, you can reach out to me personally. I'll drop my email in the chat. We can set up a time to chat. It's really both a space to provide education and collaboration, but most importantly, to foster a sense of community that is rarely found elsewhere. So just some housekeeping things. This training is recorded today. Closed captioning is on. As folks can see, we have our lovely ASL interpreter, Ali, here with us, and we'll have Sarah joining in just a little bit. And at the end of the training, we'd really appreciate it if you could fill out the survey that's linked up here on the screen. It will also populate when Zoom closes out. This is separate from the evaluation form, which we'll link you to at the end. This survey is specifically our way of addressing our program's impact over the last several years. So we'd really appreciate your input so we can continue bringing you all the great programming you know and hopefully love. All right.
Hello, everybody. Welcome. I'm so excited to see so many people. I often do a presentation for a full spectrum doula course, which is really cool, and it's probably the next largest group that I do, and this is much bigger, so this is very exciting. We've got 149 participants, 150 participants, so this is so great. If anybody has a question or comment that feels like it would be appropriate to share immediately in the moment, please let Taylor know. And if you want to just kind of put a bookmark on it, put it in the chat for the Q&A at the end, that would be great as well. Okay, so I am Celestina Pearl, aka Celestina Meow. I am the outreach director for the sex worker outreach program at St. James Infirmary, formerly just known as the outreach program. And sadly, St. James Infirmary, as of the end of this month, so coming up very soon, St. James Infirmary will be no longer. We were for almost a quarter of a century. So 2024, we would be celebrating our 25th anniversary. But yeah, sadly, no more. I think we were the only clinic and basically like community services for by and for current and former sex workers. And now hopefully we'll just start infiltrating the whole rest of the world. And St. James Infirmary will be an inspiration for that. Yes, and I and St. James Infirmary are located in San Francisco, California, on the unceded territories of the Ramaytush Ohlone peoples. So I just want to honor that we are on this land, and I want to honor the original stewards of this land, and encourage everybody everywhere to learn more about the indigenous history of the land that you are on. And it was really cool to see where everybody was coming from. And I will say a little bit more about St. James, and well, I'll probably say a lot more about the St. James Infirmary closure, and my outreach program will continue on. Um, and I think I'll get to that in just a little bit. But yeah, that's why I was calling it the Sex Worker Outreach Program. With St. James Infirmary, the whole thing is a sex worker clinic, so we just called it the Outreach Program. But now we'll be more explicit about it being a sex worker outreach program. All right, so today we're going to be talking about caring for and about sex workers. I'm going to talk about the history of St. James Infirmary, an overview of sex work and harm reduction, different types, different challenges of sex work, systemic, legal, etc., ways to respectfully engage sex workers, especially trans, BIPOC, unhoused, and street-based. Talk a bit about some resources, and we'll have some time for Q&A. So, the history of St. James Infirmary. Oh, and there we are at Folsom Street Fair. If any of you have heard of Folsom Street Fair, it is a huge open air kink and BDSM festival and celebration on the streets of San Francisco. And there we are with our little hoe gang, me and my coworkers. So in 1993, there was a task force on prostitution that was formed, and in 1996, there was a report that determined that the city's responses to prostitution were harmful. A lot of times this happens so commonly where it's, this whole idea of folks who are not sex workers and have probably little to no understanding of the realities for sex workers, deciding what is best for sex workers. Yeah, and often it comes along with taking the approach of criminalization. And the argument being that if the cops can't arrest sex workers, how can we support sex workers and quote unquote combat sex trafficking? Such a fucked up mentality. Yeah, like imagine if we applied that to like absolutely everything else. Like, are you hungry? We'll arrest you so that we can help feed you. Like, are you experiencing abuse? Like domestic violence? Well, we'll just arrest you so that we can provide you support. Yeah, like, are you a child experiencing child abuse? Well, we'll just arrest you so that we can provide you support. It's just a fucked up, backwards, super fucked up mentality. So in 1998, Margot St. James and Dr. Klausner did outreach to the sex worker community, along with a whole team of folks, and basically just like gathering what people's experiences were and what people actually wanted. And a big part of that at the time was healthcare. People not being able to find healthcare that was non-judgmental, and I would say culturally appropriate. Basically, like, the dominant perspective at the time still is, but I think even more so at the time, just viewing sex workers as criminals and pitiable, and that sex workers need saving, regardless of the actual person's situation and their needs. So healthcare was a big one at the time. This was long before most people had health insurance. So a lot of people just avoided healthcare altogether. And so in 1999, the first occupational health and safety clinic run by and for sex workers was created with the collaboration of the Department of Public Health, STD Control and Prevention, aka City Clinic, the University of California, San Francisco, UCSF, Coyote, Call Off Your Old Tired Ethics, and the Exotic Dancers Alliance. Um, it was originally located in the South of Market neighborhood in San Francisco, within City Clinic after hours. So there would be a line, like there would be a line going all down the block, all the way down the block of people waiting to get in to the clinic. Like waiting for the clinic to open. So City Clinic would close for the day, and then the doors would open for St. James Infirmary. And everybody would just come filing into the waiting room. And let's see, do I well, I can talk more about it later, but yeah, there were a lot of services and community, just to be able to like gather with community was just really like an awesome, miraculous thing, especially at the time, but we very much still need it. Um, 1990s, Coyote member Priscilla Alexander developed the program plan for St. James Infirmary that was founded on a holistic approach towards healthcare for sex workers as determined by the community. Um, so, a big part of that outreach and information gathering about what people would want in terms of supportive services and what kind of healthcare people would want. And yeah, so I mean, holistic meaning like um, uh, clothing, food, what we historically have called holistic services. So we had Reiki and massage and acupuncture, and we've had various different various different healing modalities throughout the years. St. James Infirmary services included primary care, gynecological and urological care, transgender hormone therapy, HIV, STI, TB, and hepatitis testing, STI treatment, Hep A and B immunizations, acupuncture, massage, and Reiki, peer and mental health counseling, support groups, food and clothing, safer drug use supplies. And at that time, like that was really unusual and really dicey. I mean, um, you know, it people like clinics could get shut down for offering quote unquote safer drug use supplies. So that just that in of itself was pretty revolutionary. um so yeah, just handing out clean needles and other safer drug use supplies was, that was a really big thing, and it was hard to find at the time. Safer sex supplies, information and service linkages, apprenticeship and internship programs. That was definitely like kind of, well, pretty big. In fact, it has been a really big part of my life actually, because it's there have been periods of time in my life where if I didn't have St. James Infirmary, um, I wouldn't have anything that I could really legitimately put on a resume. So to be able to say that I volunteered for like, you know, uh, a health clinic, I'm not going to put sex work on a resume. But with St. James Infirmary, when people come to us and want to volunteer or work for us, that's an asset. Um, and a lot of, and I have to tell people that. Um, and of course, we can't require that people disclose that, but I do tell people that that is an asset. And your lived experience is really important to our model of care because we are peer based. So for people to say that they're current or former sex workers, current or former drug users, current or former folks who have in the past or currently are experiencing homelessness, all of these things are assets to the kind of care that we provided at St. James Infirmary, and then in turn, being able to provide training and something that people can put on their resume, other than street-based economies, which often people can't put on a resume to then seek out other employment. And research and education. One of our early executive directors, Naomi Akers, uh, did her master's thesis based on research that she conducted through St. James Infirmary. And in fact, we were packing up the archives last night, or yesterday afternoon, and she had printed out the her research papers, uh, like giant. So basically, like it took up the entire wall. So at the time, when everybody would be hanging out in the community room, you could just look up at these research papers. Uh, Bringing to the light of day sex worker experience and just really like legitimizing that as as academic research. And then of course education, things like this presentation, and presentations within, I've done presentations with UCSF and the full spectrum doula program, and just I last summer I did this presentation at the Oregon Country Fair, someplace that I grew up. I grew up with hippie parents, and so we're in the middle of the forest with a bunch of hippies and like elders that I grew up around, and so I was really nervous, and it was really well received. So it was really cool to like talk about this stuff with that community of people, and yeah, and all the different communities of people that some people it's very unfamiliar to, and some people they're very familiar, and it may just feel like just be cool to talk about with peers. um so St. James Infirmary has moved several times and expanded services over the years to include a mobile clinic slash van services, which is the main activity of the program that I am director of, and housing program for our trans community. So the housing program is pretty comprehensive. Unfortunately, it is kind of downsizing, but still supporting the same number of people. But we did just recently, because of St. James's closure and the organization that took over, um, there one organization that was taking over the subsidy program, and what formerly was known as the Bobby Jean Baker House, which housed 16 trans and non-binary people in the Mission neighborhood of San Francisco, but that sadly had to be closed down. But all the people that were in living in that house were transitioned to the subsidy program. So everybody's got their own housing, and we have a huge number of people on the subsidy program. So a lot of trans and non-binary, gender non-conforming folks who are on the subsidy program, and then also and the subsidy program is going through an organization called TGIJP here in San Francisco. Great organization if you're not familiar with them. Um, uh, uh, Transgender, intersex, TG, oh wait, no, transgender nonconforming intersex justice program. And they do a lot of support of folks who are sex workers and trans people who are incarcerated and when they come out of incarceration. And they're taking over the subsidy program. And the San Francisco Community Health Center is taking over our navigation center. So that's another location where trans, non-binary, gender non-conforming, intersex, and cis women sex workers can be temporarily housed and have access to a lot of great services and a really great community of people. Um, and yeah, and so SFCHC is taking that over. So the mission of St. James Infirmary was to provide compassionate and non-judgmental healthcare and social services for all sex workers with special focus on street-based, BIPOC, and trans sex workers. St. James Infirmary's last day will be December 31st, 2023, after almost 25 years of service to the sex worker community. And like I just said, the trans housing program. So the subsidy program is moving to TGIJP. The navigation center is moving to SFCHC. And the sex worker outreach program will be moving to Lyon Martin Health Services. All right, so definition of sex work: provision of sexual services or performances by one person or group of people, the sex workers, for which a second person or group of people, the client or observer, provides money or other markers of economic value. The term, quote, sex worker, was coined by American prostitute activist Carol Lee, aka Scarlet Harlot, in the 1970s as a political term. She very near and dear to my heart. She passed away last year, and she was a very dear comrade. And in fact, I got to be one of the many people included in her will, which really just warmed my heart that she considered me an important comrade in the work as well. Yeah, so I think she really was an important just an important thinker in her time here with us, and it just I think was really brilliant that she thought of the term sex worker, and it just really caught on, because really I really appreciate the fact that it really neutralizes prostitution being a specifically criminal activity, and sex worker being a worker. It's work, and there's certain kinds of work that we can celebrate, and we can also commiserate, and there's ups and there's downs, and a person doesn't have to be always absolutely thrilled with the kind of work that they do, in order for it to be legitimate work and for people to deserve respect. So yeah, I think it's just really important to think of sex work in the frame of labor rights. And I can talk some more about that later. So, the law, direct contact sex work currently illegal in all states except in certain counties of Nevada where it is legalized. And we can also talk more about the difference between decriminalization and legalization. There's some pretty fucked up aspects of legalization, like in the certain counties of Nevada where it is legalized. um, Sex workers are still treated as social outcasts and can be criminalized for other things and very highly monitored. Sex workers have to be registered and submit to inspection and are not legally allowed to be on the streets of the various towns where legal brothels exist. um, Sex workers are, yeah, like I said, very highly monitored. So upon entering in some of these situations, sex workers can be arrested if they don't report directly to the legalized brothel um, upon arriving in town. Um, so yeah, so decriminalization and legalization are not the same thing, and we can definitely talk more about those differences. Um, in California, the Penal Code 647B makes it a misdemeanor offense for both providers and clients to engage in, quote, acts of prostitution. Um, Related charges: loitering to commit prostitution, lewd conduct in public, indecent exposure, um, and which, of course, are most commonly applied towards people of color, trans people, and of course, people who are just living their lives as a femme presenting person who feels sexually empowered. Whether or not they're charging money, well, really, whether or not they're charging money is nobody's fucking business but their own. Um, but but whether or not they're actually even engaging in criminal activity, they can be targeted for these related charges. Pimping or pandering, broad definition, working collectively for safety, is criminalized as both felony and misdemeanor. Sex workers can actually be arrested for pimping themselves, um, for uh, roommates of sex workers can be arrested for pimping, adult children of sex workers, partners, friends, a group of sex workers working together, even if they're just standing on the street corner together. um, you know, yeah, I mean, these are safety strategies and business strategies, and it's fucked up that they would be criminalized instead of the actual. I mean, I think people have this stereotype of what a pimp is, as I mean, I think the stereotype, I think, as we probably all know, is basically just a black man who is abusive and controlling and exploitative, and that is a stereotype, and it is not the actual reality of people's lives. um like I said, sex workers can be arrested for, quote unquote, pimping themselves, as well as all of the other relationships that I mentioned. And we need each other, and so to criminalize relationships in that way is just so fucked up. So administrative laws and workplace regulations, such as in massage parlors, strip clubs, and theaters. Yeah. So, history: sex work has a long history in the United States, yet laws regulating the sale of sex are relatively new. In the 18th century, the law did not directly address prostitution, but law enforcement often targeted prostitutes. Laws against lewdness and sodomy were used in an attempt to regulate sex work. Because, of course, lewdness and sodomy, those are not going to be applied to white cis straight men. So you can take some guesses as to who those laws were enforced against. Red light district formed in the 19th century in cities across the US in an attempt by sex workers to find spaces where they could work, isolated from outside society and corresponding stigma. And those were not yet criminalized. Ambiguity in the law allowed for prostitutes to challenge imprisonment in the courts. Through these cases, prostitutes forced a popular recognition of their profession and defended their rights and property. Sorry about the loud noise. Street cleaning going by. Despite sex workers' efforts, social reformers looking to abolish prostitution outright began to gain traction in the early 20th century. I think that's some early examples of sex negative and sex worker negative feminism, and also, let's be honest, racist feminism as well. Because if feminism doesn't include sex workers, trans women, and BIPOC women, then it isn't fucking feminism. And yeah, historically, there's been a lot of that within feminism, and still to this day, there were a lot of quote unquote feminists that supported Fosta Sesta. And we can talk some more about that later too. New laws focused on the third-party businesses where prostitution took place, such as saloons and brothels, holding the owners culpable for the activities that happened within their premises. So yeah, some of those early examples of kind of a roundabout way of criminalizing sex workers and sex work. So to ostracize sex workers from community, as well as the stability of a physical location, and the support of, and the support of the connection between those two, the connection of those two relationships. Red light districts began to close, some being forced to close and through criminalization, and some through ostracization. In 1910, the Mann Act, or the White Slave Traffic Act, made illegal the act of coercing a person into prostitution or other immoral activity, the first federal law addressing prostitution. I guarantee you that being coerced into prostitution or other immoral activity, I think was very rarely, if ever, applied to actual clients of sex work. And in just a moment, I'll talk a little bit more about that. There's some fucked up history around that. This act was created to address the trafficking of young European white girls who were thought to have been kidnapped and transported to the US to work in brothels, but criminalized those participating in consensual sex work, of course. At the start of the First World War, a Navy decree forced the closure of sex-related businesses in close proximity to military bases. The military that was coercing people into sex work. Restrictions and outright violence led to the loss of the little control workers had over their work. In addition to this, in 1918, the Chamberlain-Cahn Act made it so that any woman found to have a sexually transmitted infection, or STI, would be quarantined by the government. Quarantined, basically, basically imprisoned. Um, so and actually be in order to find out if they had an STI, um, they would be imprisoned. So imprisoned, inspected, and then further imprisoned if they were found to have an STI. Another one of those great examples of being criminalized in order to receive quote unquote support. Um, the original purpose of this act was to stop the spread of venereal disease among US soldiers. So they didn't really give a shit if sex workers had STIs. Um, they just wanted to make sure that US soldiers could could safely fuck sexually transmitted infection free sex workers. Um, Under this act, prostitutes or those perceived to be prostitutes could be stopped, inspected, and detained or sent to a rehabilitation facility if they were found to test positive for any venereal disease. During World War I, an estimated 3,000 women were detained and examined. Um, I should probably say detained, examined, and further detained. Um, the state had made sex workers into legal outcasts. During the Great Depression, Black women in New York City accounted for more than 50% of arrests for prostitution. Um, they did not account for 50% of the population. Types of sex work expanded in the 21st century. Film and later the internet provided new opportunities for sex work. In 1978, Carol Lee, a prostitute and activist, coined the term sex work as it is now used. She looked to combat the anti-porn movement by coining a term that reflected the labor and economic implications of the work. Another cool thing about the term sex work is that it creates solidarity within different types of sex work. There's a term within sex work, hierarchy, where like, you know, some people are like, you know, like street-based sex workers or folks who do sex trades, like you know, like survival sex work, basically, like for housing, drugs, what have you, are like at the bottom of that hierarchy. And then, you know, like high, you know, high paid, um, you know, high paid sex workers at the very top of that hierarchy. Um, One thing that I really appreciate about the term sex work is creating a sense of solidarity and community. I have several times I've had sex workers who were financially doing well and wanted to financially contribute towards you know the work that I do out on the streets with street-based sex workers, and also working with mutual aid. So it isn't quote unquote charity work. It's a matter of fairness and supporting each other, and being in solidarity with each other. Other similar groups formed in the 1970s and 80s to push for women's sexual freedom and sex workers' rights. A rift formed within feminism that continues today. And of course, it didn't start in the 70s and 80s. I mean, a couple of slides back, we talked about, you know, in the 18th century when, you know, suffragettes basically, fighting for women's rights, but those women's rights, you know, it was really only for some women. And that continues to this day, with some arguing for the abolishment of sex work and others working for acceptance and rights for sex workers. Like, duh, we should be in favor of acceptance and rights for all workers and all people. It's just, you know, it's backwards, totally. Anyway, in June of 1999, St. James Infirmary was founded as the first clinic run by and for current and former sex workers. In April of 2013, the San Francisco District Attorney and SFPD very reluctantly, agreed to the policy to not use condoms as evidence of prostitution any longer. Even at that time, it was the argument of like, if you take away this tool that we need to have to support people, then how are we going to support people? Like, you can't support people unless you can arrest them for something. Ugh. Anyway, the Stop Enabling Sex Traffickers Act, or SESTA, and Allow States and Victims to Fight Online Sex Trafficking Act, or FOSTA, are the US Senate and House bills that, as the FOSTA SESTA package, became law on April 11th, 2018. FOSTA SESTA is a federal law that makes it a crime for websites to enable or facilitate sex commerce. So this has resulted in advertising platforms for erotic service providers of all kinds being shut down, and has forced many of us out of relatively safe online spaces into riskier street work. A number of resource and advocacy organizations have also had to close. So I was doing the street-based van outreach. Um, Basically, it was like from one week to the next. In April of 2018, the population out there on the streets like increased threefold, and it continued that way for a while. I can talk a bit more about that history later too. It's not part of the presentation, but it's just been like a long back and forth where it's like, sex workers, deal with heavier criminalization, and then populations decrease. And then FOSTA SESTA comes along where people can't be doing, it's much, much more difficult to be doing online sex work. So population on the streets increases. The neighbors flip out and start like mobilizing the police, and then the populations decrease. It's like this whole like back and forth, and people's lives are in the balance here. So it's very frustrating. So yeah, and then even resource and advocacy organizations have also had to close, and really it's had some pretty far-reaching. Sesta Fosta has had some pretty far-reaching effects. I mean, thanks to Fosta Sesta, I mean, you know most of you probably are aware of the censorship online that people have had to go through. I mean, and it isn't just like, oh oops, like I can't say sex or S3X, or just all whatever star or like it's the censorship is actually making it much harder for people to be in community with each other, and keeping people safer, both physically as well as emotionally and mentally. I mean, we need each other. Ugh, and especially through COVID, when everything went online, and we really needed each other. And that was when a lot of mutual aid stuff came up, and I got to be the go-between for a lot of that. In 2019, California passed SB 233 to improve the health and safety of people in the sex trade, by ending the practice of, quote, using condoms as evidence in the state of California. So previously it was just for San Francisco. In 2019, in the state of California, the condoms as evidence was part of SB 233. So using condoms as evidence of prostitution, and giving people the power to report a violent crime that they've experienced or witnessed without being arrested or prosecuted for related sex work or misdemeanor drug offenses. So I try to tell people this, like, because if somebody gets arrested for condoms as evidence, if somebody gets arrested for prostitution at all, maybe there was some kind of violent crime wink, wink, that may have happened um, uh, as part of that transaction. So I'm like, if you get arrested for prostitution, SB 233. um, but I know lots of people who have still been arrested, and yeah, and SB 233 is only as powerful as people are able to actually utilize it. Um, and also, I think it is kind of fucked up that a person should even have to, be a quote unquote victim, in order to not be criminalized. In 2021, New York passed a repeal of the loitering with intent to commit prostitution law, or the walking while trans bill. Yay. And then California followed suit. In January of 2023, Governor Newsom, I hate giving him credit because his statement for SB 357, it did not sound at all like, basically it was very like political, like, he made it very, very clear in his statement that it was not about decriminalizing or legalizing prostitution. And he really, anyway, it was a big struggle. But he did sign SB 357 into law to repeal loitering with intent to commit prostitution in the state of California. And I'm proud to say that I was part of the Decrim Sex Work California coalition, sponsored by ACLU NorCal, and and basically our coalition is what got SB 357 signed into law by Newsom. So, harm reduction. Let's give props to our drug use community. Harm reduction refers to a range of public health policies designed to lessen the negative social and or physical consequences associated with various behaviors, both legal and illegal. Harm reduction policies are used to manage recreational drug use and sexual activity in numerous settings. I like to think of harm reduction as being a philosophy, a life philosophy, really, and it's been huge in my life, since probably mostly since I started with St. James Infirmary, and that was like, over 20 years ago. And yeah, and I think, kind of a little bit before then even. But yeah, I think that it's just really important to think of, when you're talking about how you can support somebody, or even like how one is living their life, that yeah, you want to think of like real support as people state that they need that support. So like, so much of this history and so much of legislation and the law has been about criminalizing, penalizing, and the quote unquote support being tied up with criminalization. And so yeah, so thank you to the revolutionary minds of drug use community and supporting each other, and bringing that mindset of actual support, and leaving the judgment behind. So, some different types of sex work. We can talk about, and here I'll just mention real quick, this picture here was a really awesome march that we did after Fosta Sesta. It was a huge march in the streets in Oakland, for sex worker rights. And so yeah, here's some of us marching. So outdoor, indoor. describes the location of the labor and the venue to find clients, street-based or internet-based, in cars, on the streets, in hotels, brothels, private residences. Um, yeah. And of course, there's various levels of safety considerations involved. And really, whether it's outdoor or indoor, like we really it's important that we're able to support each other. And unfortunately, it just really sucks when supporting each other becomes criminalized, aka like quote unquote pimping. um Survival or sex trade, so trading sex for things other than money. This can include housing, food, substances. Many people who perform survival sex do not identify as sex workers. I do think that it's important to, like, as much as I love the term sex work and sex workers, as it being like a labor rights issue, I think it's important to respect the terms that people prefer to use for themselves, but also keeping in mind that, it's kind of one of those kind of things like within LGBTQ community, within communities of color, um, that there's just certain terms that, like, if you're not of that community, within that community, that you're not entitled to use those terms. So I think I think you know just be mindful of that. And just, yeah, like, maybe if a person discloses to you that they identify with a certain term, you can ask them, is that the term that you prefer to be referred to as? Are you okay with even being out at all? Would you prefer that I use the term sex work, but also, like, just making sure we're on the same page in terms of what we're talking about? An example being, like, way back in the day, like, people signing in for services at St. James, and, like, somebody, actually several times, somebody might be like, because we're a sex worker clinic, and for clinic services, we try to somewhat discreetly screen to make sure that people know where they are, to make sure that they intend to be at a clinic for sex workers. And sometimes we might say, um, you know, are you a current or former sex worker? And some people might be like, oh, what? Like, I don't know what that is, or like, no, I'm not a sex worker. And then, talk a little bit more, and like, uh have you ever traded sex for money or anything, like housing or, whatever? And they're like, oh, yeah, 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 yeah. Yes. But they just, they're just not familiar with the term sex work. So, independent collective management describes how a sex worker finds clients and who they work with to find clients. So, some people, work completely independently. They do their own advertising, uh, and, screening and all that. They do by themselves independently. And some people do that in a collective. So, um, there might be like a group of people working together for safety, and it's a good safety strategy as well as a business strategy. Some people might have some kind of a management relationship, that some people might refer to as a pimp, but also, like, that person could just be, I've had lots of folks who are out there working on the street who tell me, they have somebody who, quote unquote, helps them out, um, and they um, and they have a really positive, um, like, they have a really positive feeling about that relationship. And yeah, so various different ways that that person can, like, quote unquote, help them out, including maybe like promoting, advertising, even childcare, stuff like that. um a specialization or particular service offered can both include or exclude penetrative contact. So yeah, like BDSM or like, kink or, just different kinds of sessions. Um, and, that may or may not include penetrative contact. Fun fact, if you penetrate your client, so in other words, if a sex worker penetrates the person who is paying money, that is legal. If the person paying penetrates the person receiving money, that is illegal. um, Escort, terms used to describe direct contact sex work that are often class signifiers. Low income sex workers can also identify with these terms. Escort services may not involve penetrative contact, but it usually does. So, yeah, that kind of goes along with that whole, the concept of the hierarchy that, that sort of idea that like escort is like, like a higher class signifier. Um, but yeah, I like to think of it as like who needs the support and who is able to provide the support, and who may be, thriving and not needing as much support. Out call, in call, the location of the services. Out calls are hosted by the client, in calls are hosted by the provider. And that can be in a hotel or somebody's home or like an apartment that people share for the purposes of working together. Yeah, or I guess even a car or vehicle of some kind. Sex work that does not explicitly involve penetrative contact with the client is not illegal in the Bay Area. So that may include pornography, webcamming, phone sex operators. None of those things are going to include penetration with the person paying for the services. Exotic dancing or stripping. Whatever happens in the champagne room happens in the champagne room. But it's kind of on the DL. Fetish work or BDSM. Um, may include penetrative contact with the client, um, escorting, again, may include penetrative contact with the client. And if it includes penetrative contact of the person receiving the money, then it is illegal. Therapeutic or sexological body work or sex surrogacy. So, high contact or direct. So, work that often involves penetrative contact or private intimacy with clients, escorting or sex trading. So, that's basically like the main objective, or, that is basically the agreement that, it's going to be fucking. Higher contact public venues, so may have physical contact with clients but often not penetrative, so stripping, peep show. So in public venues with coworkers, so there may be like contact, or high contact with coworkers, but no contact allowed by the patrons, but in some cases maybe there is. There's a lot of various different, very specific laws, and we talked earlier about those like administrative and uh specific to different different types of work. Yeah. Very low contact, no contact with client, often working independently. So like phone sex operators, call and text, webcam performers, independent and solo clips. So there's not going to be contact with the client, but there might be contact with with a coworker or with oneself. Adult film industry, no contact with client, but often having penetrative contact with coworkers. So, ways to respectfully engage sex workers. Don't make assumptions. So, I think that, you know, that can go both ways. So, you want to think of it like anybody could be a sex worker, but you never want to assume that someone is a sex worker unless they disclose to you. Um, and if they do disclose to you, that you shouldn't make assumptions about what that means for that particular person. Like, for example, like not that they're, you don't want to assume that they're being trafficked. You don't want to assume that they're in a dangerous situation. You don't want to assume if they tell you that they're a sex worker, you don't want to assume that they're like a street-based sex worker who's like actually like fucking clients. So you know, let people tell you their story in their own time as they choose to tell their own story. Respect boundaries and privacy. Many sex workers are not out. It is a very highly criminalized um, line of work. So you need to be discreet. If somebody tells you that they're a sex worker, it is not for you to tell anyone else. Um, and, if there is a situation where it seems necessary or it would be helpful to share that information, like, for example, from, like one provider to another, make sure that you have that person's explicit consent, or that, can facilitate the conversation rather than speaking for that person. And it just kind of like, that kind of general policy usually of sex work of of therapists, where, like if you see a client out in public, that, you're not supposed to like say hello to them unless they say hello to you first. So, similar kind of thing. You just want to make sure that you're not accidentally outing somebody in any way around sex work, because it is very highly criminalized and so very stigmatized. Address your prejudices. We all have prejudices. Um, and it's not really helpful to pretend like we don't. So, just like be aware of those prejudices, and whatever steps that you can take to move past those prejudices. I think a lot of that is about just getting to know people and their situations and their stories. And you'll start to realize that, whatever that preconceived notion that you had in your head is, it may not be correct. And also, like, even if it turns out that it is, that it isn't because of, your past preconceived notions, you know. So yeah, think about your preconceived notions that you have about people and situations, um, so that you can make sure that you're treating people as individuals and not applying those prejudices to people that you encounter in your life, in your in your business dealings, in your um, yeah, in the various different ways that you might be supporting your own community. Utilize a harm reduction and trauma informed approach. So harm reduction being like, drop the judgment. Like, people are living their life the best they can. And and if you're in a support profession, which many of you probably are, then you're in a position to be able to support. Make sure that the support that you're offering is based on what that person is saying that they need and or want. And and so, you can say, I think what I hear you saying is this, and I think that I can provide support in these ways. Um, and, you know, and, and not judging people for it. In terms of trauma informed approach, um, you know, be respectful of where people are at. I really feel like harm reduction and trauma informed approach really go hand in hand. You don't want to unnecessarily like re-traumatize somebody by like rehashing, like requiring that they rehash some story that they don't want to revisit. That let people tell you their stories, let people tell you about their lives, about themselves in their own time and in the ways that they feel comfortable with, rather than like, pushing people to, having to disclose more than they feel comfortable with, and not based on your curiosity, based on that person's need. Otherwise, it isn't really support, right? Promote feelings of dignity and empowerment. So, there's lots of ways that people can feel invested in and engaged in their own care. Um, and all those ways that we can, make sure that people feel respected and, um, you know, yeah, I think just treating people with respect, and also like, acknowledging, that they've gone through some hard stuff, and we all do. And, that, that has made them an expert on their own life, and also that, and also that makes them a really, that has given them some really great tools, that we can really really appreciate in our communities. Like, like all the years that I've worked with St. James Infirmary, like that peer-based model, I think has been really important. Can also be hard at times because, we're so many of us are coming from this background of deep trauma. But it also gives us, that deep empathy as well. And so, um, being able to be in positions of power, um, where, like, for example, like I'm often like advocating for people, based on what people are telling me out on the street, and also based on my own past personal experiences. um, and so, yeah, for me, that feels really empowering. And I imagine for a lot of the folks who tell me their stories, and then I facilitate, various different ways that they're able to tell their stories, like through zines. I've connected people with respectful media, and, just different ways that I'm able to make connections that, that where we both end up feeling really empowered and powerful and heard. Um, Acknowledge the huge amount of diversity in the sex trade. So I think in acknowledging, that huge amount of diversity, like referring to sex work and sex workers, like that's a huge spectrum, um, of uh, of experiences. And so, you can't just make an assumption about, somebody's situation based on the fact that they said they're a sex worker, because, that could mean so many different things. And so, we're a huge community. Respect the rights of all people to make decisions about their bodies. Oh my God, that is huge. So, bodily autonomy, bodily autonomy, bodily autonomy. I can't say that enough. Like, that's just really like, I really feel like that should be like, the universal law. Like, that should be like the golden rule. And I just really feel like that should just apply to everything, like trans rights, abortion rights, sex worker rights, um you know, like intersex newborn babies. I mean, it's just, people, I mean, I guess a newborn baby can't make a decision about their body, but respect the right of that newborn baby to make a decision when they're old enough to be able to make that decision about their body and to tell you who they are. Um, yeah, so we all deserve the right to make decisions about our own bodies. Ugh, and the legislation right now is just such a fucking mess right now around like trying to control people's bodies. That really, yeah. So respect the rights of all people to make decisions about their bodies. Watch your language and the language being used by others about sex workers. Um, kind of like I was saying, like, uh, in some cases, people within a particular community might use certain language, and that's acceptable for them to use that language about themselves or about, or like within their community. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's okay for people outside of that community to be using certain language. So, just make sure that you check in with a person, make sure that you're not outing somebody, make sure that you're using respectful language that they would like you to use. Kind of like with pronouns, like, you just want to make sure that you're using the language that that person wants to be used about themselves. Okay. So, and, that applies to sex workers, of course, just like everybody. Don't project personal feelings of pity, fascination, or disgust. Um, it kind of goes along with that, like, don't yuck my yum, or, don't like judge somebody for, I mean, there's people who, you know, actually, one of my longtime best friends, she works as a park ranger. Sounds like, it sounds like a very highly respected position. Much of what she does, like whenever I'm talking to her, much of what she does is cleaning toilets, but are people going around going like, oh, that's so disgusting, I feel so terrible for her, how could she work as a park ranger? Like, no, nobody's going around like pitying her for working as a park ranger, even though, like, on a daily basis she might be having to deal with people's shit. you know and so do nurses and so do sex workers, so it's like, don't like act, don't act like, because you're disgusted by it, that means a particular something about person that person is disgusting, for engaging in, certain activities within their work. And also, like, it isn't, you don't have the, right to be uh prying and prodding into somebody's life more than they're willing to share about themselves. So I mean, just because of your curiosity or fascination doesn't mean that, it's okay for you to like pry into somebody's life. If, much of the time people are, if you're being respectful, that people will want to tell you their story, and they'll tell you as much of their story as they feel comfortable about talking about. Remember that sex work is work. It's neutral. Work is work. you know and sex work is work. So, like, sometimes people might celebrate it, just like, during, there was a period of time during the pandemic when, like, I'm also a nurse, so, like at 7 p.m. every night people would start banging on pots and pans and cheering and whatever, you know yay, being celebrated, that's cool. But also there's, a lot of other aspects of it that are just like, you know it's work. Some stuff that I may not particularly enjoy, some parts that I might enjoy, some parts that I might feel neutral about, and it's just whatever. It's just what needs to get done. Um, but yeah, so sex work is work, and that means so many different things, so many different types of sex work, like we talked about, so many different situations, and so many different working conditions. So, as workers, sex workers deserve worker rights. We all deserve labor rights. We deserve to be treated with respect. We deserve to be safe. Um, and, you know, and we also deserve to not have our business be, um, what's the word I want to use? To, like, to be like impeded or blocked, or like all the different kinds of like criminalization that's I think a lot of it kind of goes along with like we all deserve to make decisions about our own bodies, and the way that we may monetize our bodies in so many different ways. um yeah, so do your own research. Much of sex trafficking data is overly broad or sensationalized. Yeah, I think the important thing is that if you're seeing certain statistics about sex trafficking, where is it coming from? What like what is corroborating that data, and what is the context of that data? Yeah, so if you're not going to research it, maybe at the very least take it with a grain of salt and consider that consider the source of that data. um I think most researchers, whether they realize it or not, have certain biases, and you know whether that be that that person is wanting to make sex workers look pitiable, or wanting to um, increase um, the focus on sex trafficking. Um, Sex trafficking organizations get a lot of money, and so they are financially invested in sex trafficking being as much of a thing as they say that it is. So just keep all that in mind, and if you're wondering about it, just do a little research on it. Be supportive and share resources. So connect with peer-based sex worker groups and service providers. I'll talk a little bit about some resources, but also, just a little internet search can probably help you find some really great resources in your own area. And yeah, if you find out that somebody is a sex worker and they have certain needs, certain support needs, um, you know, that could be a really great really great allyship to just know some resources that you can say, hey, I know about this this group, or whatever resource, and then you can look cool. And yeah, and also maybe somebody who works at some organization, and you can let them know about this person and let this person know about them and make that connection. um yeah, that can be really, really helpful. So resources, there's probably a lot that I would want to add to this. One thing that I'm thinking of right off the top of my head is Coyote, Rhode Island. So Coyote actually started in San Francisco with Margot St. James. So Coyote stands for Call Off Your Old Tired Ethics. This was like way back in the 70s. Fantastic, fabulous Margot St. James um, started Coyote, and she was a lifelong sex worker, activist and advocate. And when she moved to the East Coast, started Coyote, Rhode Island. Or I'm not entirely sure if she started Coyote, Rhode Island, um, or may have been some others inspired by her work. But they're really active in Rhode Island, and I really, really appreciate their newsletter. So I get their newsletter regularly, even though I'm in California. But there's like national news that they talk about, and also it's really inspiring and helpful to hear about the different kinds of things that they're going through in Rhode Island and the different kind of legislation that they're fighting for, or legislation that gets passed over in Rhode Island. So, that can be really inspiring. And also, they have a lot of direct services that they're involved in. Um, so Coyote, Rhode Island. So Coyote, 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 Rhode Island. St. James Infirmary, sadly, oh, I can't even begin to tell you how much it breaks my heart. So by the end of this month, there will be no more St. James Infirmary. So no more medical clinic and community support run by and for sex workers. Um, but yeah, just I know that there's lots of groups, including SWOP, SWOP, Sex Worker Outreach Project USA. So that's national, and there's lots of local chapters also of SWOP. There's SWOP behind bars. There's SWOP. There's local chapters all over the US and maybe even internationally, I feel like. But anyway, so they're a national social justice network dedicated to the human rights of people involved in sex trades and their communities, focusing on ending violence and stigma through education and advocacy. So I think there's a lot of like social connecting that can be done with SWAP, and they're often very involved in advocacy and legislation. So yeah, that's a really great resource for sex workers and also for allies wanting to learn more and connect with some local communities. So there just might be, wherever you're at, there just might be a local chapter. TGIJP, Transgender, Genderqueer, Intersex Justice Project, is a legal, social, emotional support organization for incarcerated trans, intersex, GNC folks, and also post incarceration. They do a lot of support with like letter writing, legal advocacy. They always have at least one lawyer on staff, and they often hire people out of jail. And like I was saying earlier, they just recently took over our subsidy program. So if you know anybody in the Bay Area that needs some help with housing, needs some help with their rent, tgijp.org would be a great resource. And they also can be a great resource if you know anybody who is trans, genderqueer, intersex, and they are incarcerated, regardless of where. They do a lot of like, legal advocacy, and also like letter writing. They do like for emotional support for trans GNCI community. Translifeline.org is a national trans-led organization. It's actually here in the Bay Area, but they provide direct service, material support, advocacy, education, and support to fight the epidemic of trans suicide. I have some friends who have worked with them in the past and maybe still do. I'm not sure. But yeah, it's kind of like, so their hotline, as you see right there, hotline 877-565-8860. You can call them up and get support. And various different ways that they provide support, I think, including like mutual aid and resources. And yeah, it's a great service. HIPS DC. So in Washington, DC, there's so HIPS DC, reducing harm and improving lives of communities impacted by sexual exchange and drug use. So they're a great harm reduction organization, hips.org. A couple of years ago, I met some great folks that worked for HIPS DC at the National Harm Reduction Conference in New Orleans. And they're really cool people. And so yeah, if you're in the DC area, um, yeah, look them up. BOZ. So here in the Bay Area, we've got Bay Area Worker Support, a group of Bay Area advocates that work for the health, safety, and livelihoods of sex workers in the wake of FOSTA-SESTA legislation. Bay Area Worker Support.org. I considered actually moving the sex worker outreach program to BOZ, but they just don't have enough of an infrastructure for that. But they're really great with mutual aid. I don't think that you have to be in the Bay Area to take advantage of their mutual aid support. They are pretty sure they're all, if not all, then mostly current and former sex workers. For sure, Maxine, who's a friend of mine, she started the group after Fosta Sesta came out. Just to, just be in solidarity and support of sex worker community. So yeah, they were a big part of that march that I showed the picture of earlier. Um, and they're just really, really active in the community, doing like events for like sex worker. Some of there's like, I don't know, handful, maybe like five different sex worker days throughout the year that are like both national and international. And so they've several times now have organized events for those. And yeah, I've joined in some other smaller marches with BOZ, and they're just a really great organization. We are dancers. So somehow the website is cut off on here, but they are a harm reduction and advocacy organization for dancers. They provide a nationwide comprehensive directory of information, resources, and support with Know Your Rights, Know Your Club, and Know Your Resources guides. So they're like downloadable and printable. And it's not just for dancers exclusively, but it's, like exotic dancers who started it, and their resource pages are really comprehensive. So at various times when I've done zines, I've gotten some really great resources from that website. But I guess just look up We Are Dancers. I think they're based in LA. But like I said, their resources are really comprehensive and not only specific to LA. Oh, and some more. Okay, so these are a bunch of legal resources. Definitely before you pass these on, do a little research, make sure that they're still going. I think one of them I had to take off because there was what were they called? Anyway, last I checked, they were defunct, but I think I took them off of this list. So oh, they were called Red Umbrella Legal, but um that, who knows, they might pop back up again. But Legal Action Center, Swap Behind Bars, SOAR Institute, Adult Biz Law, Walters Law Group, and Triple X Law, all sex worker friendly legal resources. And question and answers dialogue. Dear sex workers, we love you. It was a sex worker online series that I put on for a couple of years during the pandemic, but it kind of has petered out. And yeah, and at the end of this month, no more St. James Infirmary. But here in San Francisco, the sex worker outreach program will continue with Lion Martin Health
I just want to
Services.
thank you so much for sticking around with us, and everybody
Absolutely.
who's lingered around here. Seriously, give it up for Celestina. Again, we're going to capture all the resources in the chat. We'll send an email probably within the next week. Just be patient with us. But this is what's coming up next. So next month in the new year, which holy crap, it's almost 2024. We're going to be doing part 2 of Queer History of Harm Reduction, myself and Arlo Santiago Cruz. And then that's going to be followed up in February by Abolition and Harm Reduction, done by none other than the wonderful Shira Hassan. And please fill out our session feedback form to let us know how we're doing. And also, if you require a certificate or would like one for this session, you can request one here. Just use your phone for the QR code. My only ask is that if you are attending the other sessions or you have attended the other sessions, please submit just one request and not just one for every single one, because I am the one doing them, and it just becomes a little bit overwhelming. So that's my only ask. But yeah, thank you so much. We're going to close out the space, but I appreciate you all for being here and supporting Lighthouse. And we cannot wait to share space with you next year.